The thing is, while we can show that free trade is good for the world in general, we can't really say that its rewards are equitably distributed amongst countries and between socio-economic groups within countries. There will be winners and losers. Now, generally, these arguments for protection target the assumptions that comparative advantage theory and do have varying degrees of validity. The first and most common justification for protection is the failure of the assumption of perfect intranational factor mobility. Now, in reality, such mobility almost never exists. Politicians are pressured to impose strict import controls or, equivalently, generous export subsidies because they are necessary to prevent the complete collapse of a sunset industry the country no longer enjoys a CA in, and the massive structural unemployment that this may actually result. This is particularly troubling with Bhagwati's theory of kaleidoscopic comparative advantage, which postulates that CA of different countries, as opposed to being static, is dynamic and changing all the time. Today, Singapore has a CA in higher order services, but just 20 years ago, this CA was in engineering and in manufacturing. Such shifts of CA can seriously destabilize the economy and jeopardize long-term investor confidence. When the CA in hard disk manufacturing shifted from Singapore to Taiwan and Vietnam and all the other emerging Asian tigers in the 1990s and early 2000s, over 42,000 workers were laid off in less than 5 years. Flatted factories once owned by Maxter and Seagate and other companies, and each representing huge sunk costs, lay abandoned in Tuas and the heartlands. Now, in such cases, temporary and selective import controls can't allow old industries to decline gracefully without massive structural unemployment in the short term, and to permit supply-side reskilling policies to kick in because of their long gestational periods. Now, this is known as a senile industry argument. However, in practice, such controls tend to prove to be irreversible and end up as being neither selective nor temporary. Section 201 relief for US steel exporters, having lost their comparative advantage to Far East steelmakers in the 1980s alone, according to an Ernst & Young LLP study, exceeded more than $30 billion US. As of December 2001, there were 290 outstanding anti-dumping and countervailing duty measures in place, of which 156 cover steel products. Why this extravagance? Because it's political suicide to refuse such relief when in 2001 alone, nearly 30,000 American steel workers lost their jobs, and when the Rust Belt in the Northeast reports unemployment as high as 20% in the worst-hit areas. And while such measures may protect jobs in the protected sectors, such import tariffs will invariably hurt other industries and businesses who have to either switch to inefficient and dearer local producers or cough up the additional import duties if they choose to continue to import their raw materials. These firms, in an attempt to recoup losses, may retrench more workers. One worker protected, 10 harmed through higher prices for inferior goods or from being laid off. In the USA, for instance, steel users employ 57 workers for every one employed in steel production. The problem is that such protection inevitably goes to firms who can afford to pay for lobby groups to fight their case in Capitol Hill. Even though steel users account for 13.1% of GDP, while steel producers account for only 0.5%, the strong steelworkers union in the industrial Northeast and the well-heeled steelmaker lobby ensures that these privileged workers continue to be protected at the expense of consumers, businesses, and the government. The second justification for protectionism targets the assumption of constant returns to scale. The fact that the very significant economies of scale exist for many manufacturing firms gives rise to the infant industry argument. The theory is that new, smaller firms tend to be unable to be price competitive versus bigger international titans of business who do enjoy these scale economies. Ernesto Zedillo, in his 2000 report to the UN Secretary General, recommended, quote, legitimizing limited, time-bound protection for certain industries by countries in the early stages of industrialization for this very reason. Many countries have successfully industrialized behind tariff barriers. For example, from 1816 to 1945, tariffs in the USA were actually one of the highest in the world, peaking at 44.6% in the 80s and the 70s. By 2010, however, rapid economic growth enabled the US to slash it to just 1.3%. Of course, the assumption that Ernesto makes in his report to the UN is that these controls will eventually be lifted once local producers grow big enough to reap scale economies. Unfortunately, as Pringles potato chips would like to remind us, you can't stop at one. Firstly, retaliatory barriers from trading partners can potentially hurt the same infant firms that protection is intended to help and necessitate even bigger barriers to shield these infants, kicking off a vicious cycle of protectionism. Secondly, once industries enjoy a little taste of protectionism, they tend to want more and stronger protections. If the government chooses to cushion these firms with even higher tariffs, these firms may become complacent and suffer from inefficiency. At the same time, restricting foreign competitors increases the monopoly power of domestic producers, leading to allocative inefficiency and compromised consumer sovereignty. The producer gains producer surplus, but much consumer surplus is lost. Also, far from encouraging growth and efficiency, this complacency can lead to perpetual infants that never grow up. For example, during the 1980s, Brazil enforced strict controls on the import of foreign computers in an attempt to nurture its own infant computer industry. This industry never matured. The technological gap between Brazil and the rest of the world actually widened, while the protected industries merely copied low-end foreign computers and sold them at inflated prices. Now think of infant industries like having real children. It's okay to have a kid staying with you until they are 20 or 21, but if they choose to stay until 45, you start telling the neighbors that they've died of polio. The problem of increasing returns to scale doesn't just lead to the infant industry argument. Economist Lester Furrow postulates that they can allow for what is known as strategic trade policy. Due to the existence of such economies, many industries have high minimum efficient scales and can only accommodate very few but very large firms. Let's take the example of the world airliner market, effectively a duopoly held by Airbus and Boeing. Let's further assume that they want to introduce a new wide-body 500-seater jet. Our players have two options. They can either enter or they can leave the market. Now, warning, this is actually history material. If both firms enter the market, economies of scale ensure that the market will be saturated and that the firms must face higher operating costs. Thus, they will both make a loss of $10 million. If both firms leave, then obviously nobody makes a dime. If one firm enters and the other leaves, the entrant pockets $10 million and the firm that leaves the industry, none. In this case, whichever firm enters the market first will always emerge the winner. Let's say Airbus enters the market. Boeing can either stay or leave the market. If it stays in the market, it will lose $10 million, or box A in our diagram. Now, if it leaves, it doesn't earn anything, but it doesn't lose anything either, box B. The rational loss-minimizing move is thus to leave the industry. Therefore, Boeing is forced to leave the industry. This is known as the first mover advantage. The firm who's quicker on the draw, in this case, pockets the $10 million in profits. This only exists because economies of scale ensure that the market cannot accommodate both players. Thus, both Europe and the US will do whatever it takes to make sure their firm is the first one to enter the market. This is most often done through very generous subsidies and tax breaks, or preferential procurement rules for national flag airlines, for instance. Protectionism can ensure that one country's firm is the first to market and pockets the $10 million. However, what this tends to result over the long run is a race to the bottom, with increasingly lavish subsidies and protectionism propping up loss-making ventures on both sides of the Atlantic, which seems to be the case with the Airbus A380, for instance.